Welcome to Brazos Matters. I'm Jay Sokol. Today's episode is the crossover you never knew you needed. In the spirit of the Jetsons meet the Flintstones from 1987, it's Inside Political Science meets Brazos Matters. Our guests today are the hosts of that show, and I wanted them in here so we could talk about how they approached an extremely unorthodox election year and what things look like in the coming year. Doctors Kirby, Goidel, and Todd Kent are with the Department of Political Science at the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M. Kirby's a professor, associate department head, and graduate placement director. Todd is director of undergraduate studies and an instructional professor. Guys, thank you for joining me.
Oh, always glad to be here and talk politics.
Yes, it's great to be here.
Okay, so I'm going to give a quick backstory and then we're going to get into it. So in late 2023, I was convinced that KAMU should be doing something related to the 2024 elections. And everybody believed it's going to be the most consequential election of our lifetime. So what could we offer that was different from everything else out there? How do we leverage the talent and the expertise that we have on this campus? And how could our creation actually help people navigate the noise that would get worse and worse as we approached November? So I really felt like we could create something special. So looking back on my calendar, it shows that I lured you, Kirby, to have coffee with me on February 7, and you thought it was a great idea and apparently sold it to all the right people in political science, including Todd, okay? We recorded a test show on March 25th to see if we had anything at all, and it turns out we did. And then we recorded the real show on April 8, and it was edited and online by April 15th. So in just over 60 days, this went from Coffee House to YouTube, and that's pretty quick. So with nearly 20 episodes right now on YouTube and all the podcast platforms and the KMU website, what are your thoughts?
Oh, it's been fantastic.
Yeah?
I mean, this is, when we first talked about it, Todd and I, one of the things we said was, this is just what we do. We talk politics. We talk politics when we're not talking sports, right? Sometimes
Exactly.
we're talking Aggie football or Aggie basketball or just college football in general. But when we're not talking sports, we're talking politics, and we're talking about the types of things that we talk about on the program. And that's how we approach our classes as well. And we thought this is just such a great extension of what we're already doing and connecting into the community, because we both believe strongly that universities shouldn't sit behind an ivory tower and just sort of talk aloofly about abstract ideas and theories and concepts. We should get out and talk to people in the real world and try to convince them this stuff matters and that there's a way of going about understanding it that may move us past normal partisan politics.
You know, political science, the study of political science, it's really an art and a science. And I think that's the one thing I've learned as we've gone through this process is there's a lot that's not being talked about. And you know, we always talk about the mainstream media, but you know, being able to think a little bit below that and talk about what does it mean and how do we get there and what's going on. These are such interesting questions. It's amazing to me how many people will stop you and say, "Oh, you're a political science professor. Let me ask you a question." So evidently, it's not being answered somewhere else, and I think this is a format that we can do that.
Yeah, but you guys do most of your work in the classroom with a group of young people. Taking that outside of that and to a venue that allows anybody to consume what you're talking about, what your opinions are and your perspectives. What kind of a shift was that for you?
Well, I'll start here. You know, and I interact with lots of young people. What I try to create an atmosphere. I think part of what we do at Texas A&M is we create a situation where students feel comfortable talking about things that maybe are uncomfortable. And sometimes elections are like that, very personal to people. But we can create a situation where they feel good about it. They can talk about it. And I encourage them to say, look, have some data, have something to back up what you're saying, so it just doesn't become your opinion. And they like that. In fact, students will tell me that's what I like best about the classes sometimes is being able to express their opinion and hear other opinions.
Well, I think part of it too is I think we're both very much interested in hearing what other people think. and so we don't think we have answers. We think we have a lot of information that helps us make sense of what's happening as events are breaking based on what we understand about political science. But we also think every time something happens, we're learning something.
Yeah.
And so rather than sort of approach it from the idea of, oh, we're going in to teach you something we already know, I think our thought is, let's go learn something about what's going on based on what we already know and based on what we think we know, and see whether it still holds up out in the real world. So I just feel like we're kind of a running experiment in terms of, oh, well, this is what we thought would happen, or, oh, this is what our research would lead us to think these candidates are doing. What are they really doing? Does the theory still work? Do we need to have a new theory? Do we need to, how do we engage with people? Yeah. So that they know we're learning. We're not being a professor and coming in and trying to tell people what to think. We're trying to learn with them.
So, one of our hope from the podcast is that there would be a running dialogue out there where people are talking about some of the things that we're talking about. Mm-hmm. You kind of think about, gosh, what are we going to talk about every week? But it seems like every week something happens that becomes the topic for that show. And so it's I think we should have known that before. There's never a situation where there's not something political that we could talk about that's interesting, and people feel like not only do I find it interesting, I learned a lot. And I'm better informed than I was before I heard.
Well, with everything you know and everything you've seen, and acknowledging that you two are hyper aware of the news and campaign issues and strategies, various polls and history, what historically has happened, what surprised you about outcomes and voter behavior and so forth of these November elections? Oh, you're looking at each other like, well, yeah, I don't want to.
Everything.
Yeah? Yeah?
Oh, I was fast. I mean, think about the context of this particular election cycle. You have a former president running for office against an incumbent president who seems like he probably shouldn't be running for office, but has decided he wants to. And you have this really interesting dynamic of a rematch, and then one of them drops out. It's not usual for a presidential candidate to drop out after winning the nomination.
You didn't really have something parallel in the past to apply to this.
No, yeah. And you have to go back to Grover Cleveland to talk about a loser running again for re-election after a loss like that. Usually if a candidate loses, they're gone. Their party abandons them. They blame them for the loss. And we saw all the signs of that after 2020 and after January 6th and after 2022. It looked like the Republican Party was going to blame Trump and move on. But there he was.
Right.
And he showed that he had a great hold on the party even after. It's just been fascinating.
It is so surprising. I mean, if you look at after the election of 2020, when everybody had written Donald Trump off, he's finished, and he began to work his way back and then ran a campaign and never even participated. So I mean, he was so dominant. One thing that you asked, what surprised you? What surprised me is how Donald Trump campaigned. He campaigned to his own base, realizing there was more votes there if he could get them out. Yeah. So that was somebody that had worked in elective politics for 20 years. Nobody does that. Usually you feel like we've got our base intact now. We're going to move to the middle, or we're going to move and try to grab some others. But that wasn't the case with them.
And in doing so, he actually expanded the base. I mean, just another thing that's super fascinating. He grew his base while he was primarily playing to the people that he already had, and pulled in new voters. And did better among minorities, better among young people, just kind of across the board. That's incredible. It's if you're not you can think what you want, about whether the election outcome was good, bad, or indifferent. That is an incredible. The moment we're living in historically, if you're not like, wow, you can be scared, but it's an incredible moment that we're living in, and it's an amazing political moment to be able to watch this and witness what happened in this election cycle. I'm just glad to be a part of it.
If you grew up during the Reagan years where if you were a Reagan Republican, this is not the Reagan Republican Party that you knew. I mean, it's amazing to me to see how parties change over time, and certainly we've seen a party shift. If you look at the demographics of the voters on the Democrat side and the Republican side, it's almost been a 180.
You guys spent a lot of time in your podcast talking about how people get their information and how young people get their information. And you have young people in your classrooms. So when we were growing up, we tended to have the same political beliefs as our parents. That seemed like a natural thing. But there's so many sources of information available to young people. What did you see and hear from the students in your classes? What were they absorbing? What were they expressing? Were the strategic campaigns, targeted campaigns from the Trump side or the Harris side, were they hitting the targets? Like, what did you guys pick up from all that?
Well, my students tell me that definitely they're getting their news from social media, and all the research says that that's what's happening. They are concerned about accuracy. So I challenge to them is you can make a lot of money in the future if you can find a way to have accurate news going across the social media platform. But it does make you think about what's the future of the media as we know it. The broadcast TV, maybe radio, these types of things, because students, they are all in on social media, and even though they recognize it has shortcomings, which was interesting to me.
Yeah, and the real challenge is you've seen the age of big media is over. It's done. Whether we call it big media or traditional media or whatever, but we saw at one point during the campaign, and you talk about what surprised us. You see Kamala Harris doing some really interesting stuff on TikTok, right, and going and creating these memes and seeming like they're catching on and they're doing well. And then of course the Taylor Swift endorsement, all of these other non-traditional sources, but at the same time, Trump and Harris to some extent are also going on podcasts, going and finding the voters where they are in terms of the media that they're using, and very much targeting those voters. Very hard in today's politics to talk to a big, wide audience. And so I think that's the future of media, is its niche. It's, if you want to find young males, you need to go where they are in terms of Joe Rogan. If you want to go find young females, you go into the other podcasts. Yeah.
Right. Have you noticed, though, a change over time in how plugged in your students are, how aware they are, just their base knowledge of candidates, issues, the whole thing?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard. Sometimes it's hard because we work here at Texas A&M. Our Texas A&M students are engaged, and they like to be part of stuff. So they were very engaged in what was going on in the election, and so that was very interesting. I think today's young people they get their information in different ways now, and it will encourage them to be involved. I took a group of Aggies to Europe, and they asked me to give a lecture on the U.S. election. And students from the local university we were at streamed in because they cared so much about the U.S. elections. Yeah. And these were German college students. And I think the same thing we're seeing here on this campus is a lot of interest. They may not, show it the same ways that we would expect them to, but they're interested. They care. They think it does matter. And they were registering to vote. A lot of them drove home and asked if they could miss class so they could vote. So we're seeing that now. I haven't looked at the numbers to see the turnout among that group, but we know that group across the nation, there was a slight shift to Donald Trump or the Republican, and so that was unique from previous elections.
So does your teaching change as a result of this whole election process, or does it change because you've now hosted this show and you somehow changed in some sort of way? Now that you're big talents, of course, is what I'm getting at. But no, going through this process and having conversations with researchers from other universities and then engaging with your students and so forth, has it changed your approach at all, or do you just do what you do?
That's a big question. I think the election unquestionably changed how. Now, I was teaching a media and politics course, which is especially appropriate given the show and given the other parts of this. So we were very much thinking about where people are getting their information, but it means once upon a time, if I was teaching media and politics, we could focus on, a limited segment of outlets that are providing information. I think now you can't rule out any outlet as being politically important in some shape or form, and we have to be way more open to the possibilities that something that we wouldn't have thought was very political could become political or could have political impact, or that people are paying attention to it. And so I think we, to sort of the earlier point, we have to ask the students where they're at. So they can help teach us about what's going on with something like media and politics, as opposed to us relying on what we already know.
Yeah.
One thing that we've done, I think some of our best shows that during the Inside Political Science is when we've had a guest on. And really what that means is that we've asked somebody who's an expert in another area to come on, whether talk about social media or economics or previous campaigns, these types of things. And I think that in the classroom, I find myself doing more of that. They're asking, not necessarily having a guest in, but talking more about what other people are talking about when it comes to these various topics. And I think we're a university. We need to call upon experts in other areas, because we can learn from one another.
Yeah, I think some of your best shows were with those guests. It was really interesting because you guys really knew the questions to ask those guests in order to get some of their insights. And that's where I found some of the most interesting listening. If you just tuned in, I'm Jay Sokol. You're listening to Brazos Matters. My guests today are Kirby Goidel and Todd Kent from A&M's Department of Political Science, and they're also co-hosts of KAMU's Inside Political Science podcast. So, the Texas legislature convenes its regular session in January. It's going to run through June, at least in its regular session. What will you two be watching for, and what will you tell your viewers and listeners to be watching for?
So one of the first things I think is we're going to be there are going to be a lot of ideas that are thrown out.
Sure.
A lot of those ideas are going to be really bad. So one of the first things you have to tell people is don't fall into the trap of just because someone comes up with some crazy idea that sounds like it's really bad that it's going to become policy. It might, but bear in mind that there is a political process which helps us screen out some of the ideas. And so, every year there's a list of things that when you see the initial proposals come out, you're like, oh, that's bad, that's bad, that's bad. I hope it, and so to think about it in terms of it has to go through this process, and this is the reason that we have institutions in place, is to hopefully make sure that there's some screening out of those bad ideas, and sometimes legislatures are good at, they're not always very good at it. So
what's the phrase? Worry about everything, panic about nothing.
Yes, yeah.
That's what it sounds like you're describing.
Yeah, that's a much better way of putting it, because there's gonna be a lot of proposals on the table, but not all of them are going to become law, and so. Well,
I think one thing for us to be watching for in the Texas legislature is to see how much what's going on the national level affects what people are talking about on the state level. Texas is a very large state, and the interests are diverse, whether you talk about the Valley, the Houston area, Dallas, the Metroplex, West Texas, and they all have kind of different needs. And that's why Texas produces so many bills that are debated, and not all of them become law. But I think how much of is what happens in Texas going to be Texas focused versus kind of gleaning off of what's happening nationally? This idea of cutting the budget, or this idea of is Texas going to be, how are we going to solve our energy problems? Are we going to do it with more natural gas, or is it going to be more sustainable energy or renewable energy? So it's going to be interesting to see, what Texas does. The Republicans did very well in Texas in the last election, and I think you're also going to see some politicians posture for future bigger office.
Yeah. I've heard some people describe it as the country is becoming more like Texas. Does that sound right?
Well, you could argue that, and in some ways, I think the things that if you look at what Governor Abbott over the last years, he he was very strong on the border, and that became a major issue in the presidential election. And I think he was kind of overwhelmingly praised for some of his efforts along the border. I think his decision to put illegal immigrants on a bus and send them to D.C. and Chicago, New York, those that may have been one of the most astute political move of the last few years, just because it said, this isn't my problem, this is everybody's problem. And I think that changed the debate.
Yeah, how do you take a local issue like that and then make it? Yeah, I think that's right. It was in our backyard.
Yeah.
How do you put it in the backyard of Washington D.C.? How do you put it in the backyard of Boston? How do you put it in Chicago and New York and these other places? And but that's an interesting idea. Do national politics become more like Texas politics? I've heard that said more generally about the South. The idea that the South used to be this really distinct region of the country, and it became less distinct over time. And then some people much smarter than I am made the observation, what's happened is national politics have become Southern politics. not that Southern politics have become less Southern. So
is Texas, do you think, unique in its political style, or are we just sort of the loudest representation of Southern states?
Maybe a little bit of both. I would argue. I'd love to hear what Todd has to think about this, but I don't think of Texas as a traditional Southern state. And I've been in Louisiana and have in Kentucky and in other places in the South, and I think of them as not having as quite as strong of a business presence orientation in terms of Texas. In some ways, I don't want to say progressive because I think that's the wrong word, but it does seem like when you come to Texas from outside of Texas, there are things that Texas politics does really well. Like, it seems like it wants to solve problems that help business perform better and do better and attract businesses from other states.
SpaceX?
Roads, right? Infrastructure, things that other Southern states especially often aren't putting money into. Texas is willing to put money into. And as an academic, it seems like every session someone talks about ending tenure, but I've also seen pretty good financial support from the Texas legislature in terms of it seems like they recognize the importance of universities to economic development in a way that I don't think every other Southern state does. So I hope that sort of maybe the distinction there is sort of the Chamber of Commerce Republican is still important in Texas, whereas in other places it's almost completely more cultural. Not that we don't have cultural conservatives, but it's that business-oriented approach, I think, that is unique.
I would agree with Kirby. The Texas legislature has done a good job of setting out this business climate that's attracting. That creates growth. It creates jobs. It creates a sense of optimism here. We have many fine universities in this state, and that's again the being willing to fund those universities. Also, we are a big beneficiary of the energy industry over the years, and that's laid the groundwork for Texas A&M and University of Texas being great Tier 1 universities. So that's a very good help. But even though you have those resources, what are you going to do with it? Now we've created a climate that is attracting out of state industry, which is it's going to be good for our young people in the future, as there's more and more high quality jobs growing up in the state of Texas that transcend just the energy markets.
Yeah, and talking about energy, it's kind of fascinating to watch a state that's so oil and gas heavy, but also really been innovative on alternative energy forms. And so what drives that? I think it's this business-oriented approach.
So what do you two see as the main issues that you're going to be talking about in 2025? If there's a way to look into the crystal ball, whether it's nationally or from the state legislature, what are the big ones you think you're going to be tackling?
I'll take a stab at that. I think we're going to be talking about the economy, and I know we've always talked about the economy, but it was such a driver of the election that I think that we're going to see not only the state level, the local level, but also the federal level. What is are the group in power able to keep their promises when it comes to the economy? Because if not, you're going to see. We'll see how strong the shift was to the Republicans. So I think it's going to be really important, because that was really, if you get down to in my analysis, you get down to the election, it was about the economy.
Yeah, and also and you mentioned, we were talking earlier about foreign policy. I think it's also the economy and America's role in the world, because I think these two things are connected in really important ways, because one of the reasons that Donald Trump did so well on the economy, part of it was inflation, but part of it was also globalization. Globalization has been mostly good, but it has also hurt people disproportionately. So not everyone's benefited, and those people have had grief. And so that played out in the elections. What is America's role in the world? What is our role in terms of the economy? What are we going to do about tariffs? How is that going to play out? Just really fascinating. And then, we have events like in South Korea,
right?
An emerging event. What's going to happen between the U.S. and South Korea with Trump, as opposed to with a Biden, with more of an institutionalist, more of a traditional foreign? Just lots of really interesting questions coming up.
Well, and you see a lot of opposition to the U.S. out there in the world, more than usual. The BRICS, arguing that they're going to move themselves out from the using the dollar as the trading currency, and Donald Trump actually going at them and saying you better not do that. And so I think the economy it spills over to the rest of the world. Yeah. But the bottom line is people still need to trade with us, and we need to trade with other people. But I think some of those partnerships are shifting.
Yeah, and then what happens with immigration?
That I think you're going to be spending a lot of time talking about.
Yeah. It's going to be because if we look at what some of the things that Donald Trump promised, if he takes real action on those and is aggressive and in terms of his action, they could have negative effects going back to the economy, on the economy. Tariffs is one of those. Immigration is one of those. I'm really interested to see if he was using that as a way to position himself symbolically, or whether he's serious in terms of actual policy action, and if those policy actions have the consequences I believe they will.
Do you realize we have actually blown through our time here today? Like, I could keep talking to you guys for a while, but we've kind of done it. And so Kirby and Todd, thanks so much for being here, and also thanks for being such great influences on my favorite Aggie political science major, Grant Sokol. I know that he appreciates both of you and the department very much.
Well, let's do it again soon.
We need to do it again soon, but thank you guys for being here. And by the way, you can visit tx.ag/Inside Political Science to find out more about their show, and everywhere that you can enjoy it on demand. Brazos Matters is a production of Aggieland's Public Radio, 90.9 KAMU FM. We're a member of Texas A&M University's Division of Marketing and Communications. Our show is engineered and edited by Matt Dittman. All Brazos Matters episodes are available on YouTube and on podcast platforms like Spotify and Apple, also on the NPR app and the KAMU website. We'd love for you to rate and review. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Jay Sokol. Hope you have a wonderful day.